I really quickly want to apologize in advance because the fellow college students who surround my dorm room are being insanely loud and obnoxious at the moment, and you will probably hear them throughout the duration of this video. What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and welcome to episode 6. 7? This is episode 7. If you can't tell, I'm a little tired. Welcome to episode 7 of the 2023 Halloween special. If you haven't yet watched the previous 6 episodes, I've linked them right up above. Go check them out. It's been a blast. And tonight we are going to be talking about the film that brought the Scream franchise back to life. Scream 5, or Scream 2022. This film was directed by Matt Bettinelli-Olphin and Tyler Gillett of Radio Silence, and it stars mainly Jenna Ortega and Melissa Barrera as our two new leads. 25 years after the events of the original film in Woodsboro, California, a new killer dons the Ghostface mask and begins yet another series of killings in Woodsboro, but there just may be something deeper at play behind the scheme. I know it seems a little weird because the last Halloween special I did, which was the 2021 Halloween special, because I wasn't able to do one in 2022, I talked about on that special the original Scream, so it would make sense for this special to talk about Scream 2 and Scream 3 and Scream 4, but I didn't, because I noticed a theme with a lot of the movies that I'm talking about on here, and they're relatively newer horror films, because I feel like a lot of people constantly always talk about how movies just aren't good anymore. There's no good movies, and particularly horror movies, and I'm like, there's actually a shit ton of really good horror content out there at the moment. 2022 was the best year for horror that we've had in a long time. So I decided, why not talk about these new Scream movies as a part of this special? They're relevant and they're also good movies. As I've mentioned, I love all the Scream movies. I think that they're all insanely fun, very smartly written for the most part, slasher horror comedies, and I legitimately don't think that there is a bad entry. Most people would say Scream 3 is probably the objectively weakest entry, but I even have come to really enjoy that movie over the past few years. I actually find a lot to enjoy in it. And a lot of people were skeptical when it was announced that Scream 5 would be happening and would be coming back to reboot the franchise because of the death of Wes Craven, who directed the first 4. People just weren't really ready and weren't really wanting a Scream film that wasn't directed by Wes Craven, which this film, Scream 5, was the first Scream film to not be directed by him. But then this movie came out, and people loved it for the most part. I mean, people had their issues, obviously. It's always going to happen when a beloved franchise is rebooted with a new cast and a new crew for the most part. But overall, consensus-wise, people really enjoyed this one. One of the things I love the most about this movie is how much it plays around with the formula of a Scream film, because obviously, naturally, the Scream movies are very satirical, and each and every one critiques horror in its own unique way that also applies to the film itself. That's what's so great about the Scream movies. It's one of the reasons why they're so entertaining. But this movie has a lot of fake-outs. There's a lot of things where it makes you think like, okay, yeah, it's a Scream movie, I know it's about to happen, you're doing it well, you're doing the thing, that's cool, but then it completely subverts your expectations. And a great example of that right from the beginning of this movie is the beginning of this movie, the opening scene. There's a really good fake out with the voice where Jenna Ortega picks up the phone and you hear, hello, and you're like, oh shit, it's Ghostface, but then he just starts talking like a normal guy. He's like some college student or whatever asking for Jenna Ortega's sister in the film, and you know, he's stuttering over himself, he just sounds like a guy, and then eventually he very slowly, it's not like a quick switch like into the scary voice and it's like, oh my god, it is Ghostface. It's like very gradually his voice gets quieter and quieter, more whispery, more gravelly, and then you slowly realize, oh, okay, so this is Ghostface. And it's so good. But that's not the only way the opening scene subverts our expectations. And I'm not going to spoil this movie just in case you haven't seen it. And I just want you to know that what I'm about to say may sound like a spoiler, but it's not. It's literally the opening scene of the movie, and it's one of the reasons I love the opening scene so much. Every single Scream movie opens up with a kill, or multiple kills, depending on which Scream movie you're talking about. But unanimously, they all open up with a kill. At least they did up until this one, because you watch the opening scene in this movie and you're thinking, okay, so this is the opening kill of the film, and it's like, oh my god, Jenna Ortega was all over the marketing and now she's dead. That's really surprising. It's similar to what the original Scream did, where Drew Barrymore was all over the marketing and then she dies within the first 10 minutes. Sorry if you haven't seen the original Scream, but it's also one of the most famous scenes of all time, so you know. But yeah, it was just something that I'd never seen before in a Scream movie, to have the opening kill not actually be a kill and have Ghostface have to flee the scene. Now, every single Scream movie critiques the horror genre as a whole, makes fun of the tropes and cliches. We know this, we're used to this, we are aware of this. But something that each individual one also does is critique the specific type of film it is within horror canon. The original Scream was just its own standalone horror movie, so it just critiqued horror in general as a genre. And then it was so successful, so then they made Scream 2, which was a sequel to that film, so it is a horror sequel, and because of that, Scream 2 critiqued horror sequels. And then they made Scream 3, which was the third film in a trilogy of horror films, so Scream 3 criticized the tropes and cliches of horror trilogies. And then Scream 4 happened in 2011, just over 10 years after Scream 3, and it was a horror reboot of sorts, and so that film critiqued horror reboots and remakes. And Scream 5 similarly is also a reboot, but it also is coming out after this big renaissance of what is known as elevated horror, which, yes, most people in the film community hate that term, but that's the term that's being used. I hate the term as well, but that's what we're going with. The reason a lot of people don't really care for that term is because it makes horror as a genre seem just automatically lesser than, and that there's only certain types of horror movies that can be considered like genuinely quality, and it sort of dismisses the entire rest of the genre, which is just not true. There's great horror movies in every subgenre of horror. But this film is very aware of that fact, and it pokes fun at this new renaissance of elevated horror, this idea of elevated horror movies that are scary, but there's like emotional and darkly psychological, like thematic undertones, and it's a genuinely like very emotionally impactful and resonant story. Movies like The Witch and Hereditary and It Follows Midsommar, these films are obviously referenced in this movie time and time again. And I think every single Scream film does a great job at critiquing the select type of horror film that it is setting out to critique, and that it is including this one. I think that this movie does a great job at satirizing and critiquing the concept of requels, because it's not just elevated horror that it's critiquing, it's also critiquing requels, which is why this movie is called Scream and not Scream 5, because this has happened with the Halloween franchise. It also happened with Hellraiser. It has become a trend where when filmmakers want to reboot a beloved horror franchise, the reboot movie is simply given the same title as the original. And this movie has a lot of jokes to make about that. Also, this movie is extremely well directed. Radio Silence does a great job at sort of infusing the Wes Craven style into it, where it's very well paced and very entertaining throughout, and just genuinely very well directed, shot, and composed, but that doesn't stop them from putting their own directing style stamp on the Scream franchise, and I think that they really succeeded in that front as well. It is a darker and more serious Scream film, but I don't think it's really as serious as a lot of people made it out to be. A lot of people were like, oh, this movie just isn't as funny, like it's good, but it's just not as funny, it's not as humorous as the other ones, and I actually strongly disagree. I think this movie has just about as much comedy as at least Scream 4 did, which, you know, a lot of people seem to like. But there are aspects of this movie that are handled more seriously than the other films, and I actually think that that works in the film's favor, particularly some deaths in the film and characters' reactions to them that are genuinely heartbreaking. This film also did the impossible, and that is give us a brand new cast of characters that we don't hate, and that we actually kind of love. I love this new cast of characters. I think all of the actors do an incredible job, and I particularly love Randy's replacement in this movie, since obviously Randy is not with us anymore in the franchise by the time this installment happened. And they had this character be Randy's niece, and this actress, I'm sorry I'm forgetting her name at the moment, but she does an incredible job at filling those shoes, and those are very big shoes to fill. It's a very, very iconic performance in the original Scream and Scream 2 that means a lot to a lot of people, so I can't imagine that was an easy task. It was probably a very daunting one, but she did an amazing job with what she was given. She has a monologue in this film that, in my opinion, is almost just as great as Randy's monologue in the original Scream. But the two main new characters in this new set of Scream films, Sam and Tara Carpenter, they are sisters, and I wonder who that last name is referencing, they are actually incredible, very well fleshed out characters with a very deeply emotionally powerful backstory, which again, this movie is sort of poking fun at elevated horror, and the whole thing with elevated horror is that it's a horror movie, but there's emotional and thematic things that are really intact and things like that, and this movie does that as well. But it does it very, very well, because that's not a trope of elevated horror that is a bad thing. It's the whole reason why it's even termed elevated horror in the first place, because of how quality those things are. And so they made sure to make it a quality piece of this film, and they do. The backstory with these characters is really, really good. But also, these two actresses just do an insanely good job. Jenna Ortega, obviously, but also Melissa Barrera, who I wasn't really familiar with until this new set of Scream movies. They do a genuinely amazing job, and I know people tend to look down on horror, and they see these kinds of performances, they're like, yeah, it's a horror movie, but like, you gotta look at this objectively, man. These actresses are tapping into emotions that are very difficult to portray on screen convincingly and effectively, and they both do it so well. Horror acting, and I have always said this, and I will always stand by this, horror acting is some of the hardest acting to do, and they pull it off in this film. Also, with this film, in true Requel fashion, some legacy characters return, namely Dewey Riley, who was always one of my favorite characters of this franchise, and I'm pretty sure most Scream fans can agree on that. David Arquette, though, is genuinely amazing as this character in this film. I was a little skeptical when they said David Arquette was going to be coming back, though, because, like, obviously I was excited to see the character, but I was like, oh, David Arquette is older now, I don't know if he's going to be able to... All worries out the window when I actually watched the movie, because he's genuinely so good in this film, and a big part of the emotional impact of it as well. But of course, Courtney Cox and Neve Campbell both return, and Neve Campbell more so in the final act of the movie. She comes like sort of between the halfway point of the movie and the start of the third act. But it is a wonderful sight to see all of these legacy characters back on screen with each other, just kicking ass. I mean, Neve Campbell is awesome in this movie. This is one of my favorite performances of hers in the Scream franchise. Remember how I mentioned that the opening scene of this movie was really good at subverting your expectations, making you think it was going to be predictable, and then subverting your expectations, pulling the rug out from under you? This entire movie is actually pretty good at doing that. I can't really go into detail about certain things because it probably would lead me to talk spoilers, but I do just want to make it known and make the point that I think this movie does a very good job at subverting the Scream formula in a lot of really clever ways. I also think that Ghostface in this film, and I'm not talking about the person behind the murders, I'm not talking about the actual culprit behind this whole elaborate murder plot, I'm just talking about Ghostface themselves, like Ghostface as a character in this film. When the mask is on, cloak is on, this is one of my favorite Ghostface. This Ghostface is pretty frightening and makes an excellent comeback in this movie. That opening scene is also epic at reintroducing Ghostface because it knows people are eager to see another Scream movie. You're bringing life back into the franchise. So showing Ghostface on screen again, showing Ghostface on screen killing again in particular, that's a big moment, and they really didn't shy away from that. They knew that, and they made sure to make it have maximum impact. And the kills in this film and the Ghostface in this movie are genuinely brutal. It really is brutal. It's not the most violent Scream film, but it is one of the most intense and one of the most brutal, I would say. There's also two cameos in this movie that I absolutely adore. There's a scene in the film where somebody's watching a video with James and Chelsea from Dead Meat. Now, the YouTube channel in the film is not called Dead Meat. I actually forget what it's called. But James and Chelsea from Dead Meat, which is one of my favorite channels, and they're just two of my favorite content creators of all time. I love them. I adore them. If y'all are watching this video, I doubt that you are, but if you are, absolutely love you guys. Keep doing what you're doing. Your content is amazing, and you guys are amazing at what you do. So talented. I was so happy to see them in this film, and it just feels right. And then there was a cameo from one of my favorite shows of all time, and in my opinion, a very underrated show, even though when it was running, it was obviously successful, but, you know, nowadays people look back on it and just sort of laugh, but Dawson's Creek has a cameo in this movie, and I have always stood by this, and I will still stand by this as an adult now, because, you know, I got hooked on Dawson's Creek when I was like 13 and 14, but now I am an adult, and I still feel comfortable saying that Dawson's Creek is a genuinely amazing show. And it was also written by Kevin Williamson and created by Kevin Williamson, who created the Scream franchise. So you know. It was just really nice to see those two cameos in this movie of things that I genuinely just adore. Now, while this movie doesn't have as many signature chase sequences, because that's a very common thing in all Scream movies, people come to expect it, they love to see it, it's a staple of the Scream franchise that there's a lot of really fun chase sequences. This movie doesn't have as many chase sequences, but it does have a lot of very tense, suspenseful sequences, which I think the reason that there aren't as many chase sequences and more so of a focus on slow building tension in this movie is because of the fact that this movie is satirizing elevated horror, which puts more of a focus on slow building tension rather than wall-to-wall jump scares and insanely tense chase sequences. But it is very well done in this film. I think this movie has some of the most tense sequences of the entire franchise. Rewatching this movie today also made me realize something, and I kind of wish people talked about it more. There's sort of an unspoken tragedy to each and every Scream movie. Because yes, they're really fun and entertaining slasher comedy films that we have a blast watching, but each movie does sort of have this looming tragedy over it. Like, all these people are being killed. Friends, family members, and things like that. Sorry for the angle change. My phone ran out of storage right in the middle of the review, and I had to set everything back up and see, like, specifically in the last clip where I left off, because I did go through the entire rest of the review completely unknowing that my phone had stopped recording, so nothing kills your motivation more. That shit really pisses me off. But anyway, as I was saying, there is sort of an unspoken tragedy in these films that nobody really talks about that much, but it's definitely present, and like in every Scream movie, because you gotta think, all these people are being murdered. It's fucking tragic, man, and like some of the characters' reactions to things in this movie really hit that home, and it really makes you realize how intact the emotional core of these new movies is. This movie also has one of my favorite lines in the entire franchise when Sam Carpenter is sort of giving Sidney some back talk, like, to her face, which obviously would piss off fans of the original films who love Sidney so much, because obviously we're gonna be thinking, what does this new girl think she's doing? Like, shit-talking the OG final girl of this franchise to her face, like, what the hell? And the writers and the filmmakers knew that we would think that, so as soon as Sam starts smack-talking Sidney, Gail turns around, she's like, hey, watch your tone, new girl. Which is one of my favorite lines in the franchise, and it's exactly what is going through our heads as audience members, so I love that they included that. This movie also brings back certain score cues from the original films as well, like Sidney Prescott's theme. The way that that is brought back in this movie is done in glorious fashion, and it is so satisfying, and I loved it. I also think that this movie has one of the best third acts of any Scream film, definitely in my top 3 for sure. It's very well paced, very entertaining, and just good Scream content. It feels so in the moment. Really, my only issue with this movie is just some of the dialogue. Some of the dialogue and maybe some of the delivery of it just doesn't land as well as maybe the writers and directors hoped it would, but that's really the only thing I can think of. Other than that, I really do love this movie, and I also love the explanation and truth behind the killings and the mystery in this film as well. It's very well done in my opinion. So without further ado, I'm gonna give Scream 5 a 9.5 out of 10. Look, I rate movies based on how well they did what they were supposed to do, and I think that this movie did what it was supposed to do extremely well. Guys, thank you so much for tuning back into the 2023 Halloween special. Look forward to episode 7 of the special coming to you very soon. As always, thank you so much as always for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep writing, keep shooting, and keep editing.